Friends, welcome back to our channel Demystify Frontend, and this is the fifth video in the series Build Your Own Angular Forms, where we are creating Angular form from the scratch. So in this video we are going to write the implementation for SelectControlValue accessor. And if you are new to the channel, I recommend you go and watch the previous videos in order to gain maximum out of this video. So in the last few videos we discussed around the low level design of this ngModel directive. Okay, like how ngModel interact with different directives in order to read and write to the host elements. And we also converted this low level design into the code implementation. Okay, so let's get started. So in the last video, as you saw, like how these control value accessor directives, like default control value accessor and checkbox control value accessors, how these are written, how they manages in dealing with the complexities related to each different type of form elements, like how they subscribe to the events to read the updates from the host element, and how they make update onto the host element when they receive the update from the ngModel side. So far our ngModel implementation is supporting only few controls like normal inputs and the checkbox. So in this video we will be writing the select control value accessor, which will enable the support of the single select in our ngModel implementation, and that will eventually enable the two-way data binding for the single select as well, right? So as you can see on the screen, this is the updated low level design of ngModel directive, where we have made some changes in order to support one more form control, that is single select. So when you apply the ngModel directive on a single select, so what happens? This select control value accessor is also instantiated, right? Based on the selector. ngModel, as usual, it will inject the ng value accessor DI token, but now since it is applied on the select, so now it will get hold of this select control value accessor, right? Like earlier we saw like how when we apply the ngModel on the normal input, ngModel get hold of default control value accessor, and when we apply the ngModel directive on the checkbox, how it get hold of the checkbox control value accessor. So on the same line, when you apply the ngModel on the select, it get hold of the select control value accessor, right? And you know, select control value accessor will have the same interface. So because all these control value accessor directives, they follow a standard interface, right? So that ngModel can talk to any of the control value accessor through the standard methods they implement through a common interface, that is control value accessor. And now when it inject the DI token, it get hold of this control value accessor, and through which it can read and write value onto the host element. Okay, so in this video we will be writing the implementation for the select control value accessor. So without wasting your time, let's get started. So we have added the select box in our use case component. So now we will write the select control value accessor, which will enable the two-way data binding for this drop down as well. Okay, if you have watched the previous videos, you must know like we put everything related to the form management, related to the Angular form in our form module, which we created in the first video. Okay, and you can see we have exported the directives from here, which we can use in our use case component. So let's add one more directive, that is select value accessor. So what we can do, we can copy everything from the default control value accessor and paste here. Okay, and make the changes which are relevant to the select control value accessor. So first of all, we will have to update the selector. So this select control value accessor will not be instantiated for random select, but only for the select where we apply the ngModel directive. Okay, so this is the selector, select with ngModel attribute. All right, and we can just rename the class to select control value accessor. Okay, so this is something we will write later on, and we are subscribing to the change event, and this will also expose itself. This class, this directive class will expose itself on a DI token, okay, which we saw in the diagram, this one. Okay, and let's rename it to select value accessor. And let's put it into the providers array of this directive. Okay, so far so good. And okay, I'll tell you one more thing, like when you register for an event in a directive, there is a shorthand for that, right? So instead of doing this, what we can do, we can also provide it in the directive configuration. So there is a key host, right? And it accepts an object, where in the object you can specify the event. So key will be the event which you want to listen to, which you want to subscribe to, and you can pass all the type of events which you want to listen on this host element, where this select control value accessor directive is applied, right? So we are interested in the change event basically, right? So we can just give it this, and then the value we can simply call the on change, right? And to the on change we can simply pass the value from the event object. All right, and we can get rid of this. Okay, now what we need to do, so I'm back into the use case component. So what we need to do, let's apply the ngModel directive and see what happens. And we provide one property which we have defined here in the app component. What's that? This is selected gender. Okay, and the options are generated from this array of genders, right? Okay, and the option value is set to gender abbreviation, that is this. Okay, then it should be f actually, right? Because in the option value we are passing the abbreviation. So when we pass the value, selected gender value to the select, it should be the same which we put in the option value. Okay, let's see what happening. Okay, I think something is breaking here. Okay, so yeah, just notice one thing. Injection token ng value accessor, no provider for injection token ng value accessor. Why we got this error? Because if you go back to the ngModel implementation, so what we are doing here, we are injecting one token, ng value accessor, di token, right? And this di token is provided by, okay, let's move to the slide. This ti token, ng value accessor di token, this is configured by the directives, by the control value accessor directives, which gets applied onto the host element where you apply the ngModel, right? Like in our case, in our previous cases, in our previous video, when we apply the ngModel on the simple input like text input, email input, number input, password input, this default control value accessor was instantiated based on its selector. Okay, if you go back to the default control value accessor, you will see the selector. So what is that selector? It is like input. It applies on all the inputs except the checkbox, where we have ngModel directive applied as well, right? So for this input, this instance was created and it configured the di token. So ngModel was getting uh, the instance of this directive for the di token which had injected. Similarly for the checkbox, what was happening? It was getting the instance of checkbox control value accessor on this di token. Similarly, when ngModel is applied on the select, it should get hold of a proper control value accessor corresponding to the select, that is select control value accessor. So we have not exported this directive, so that's why it is not applying, and ngModel doesn't get any service instance for that di token. So let's quickly export this in our forms module. Okay, so first we need to declare. Okay, now export it so that it can be used in the rest part of the application where we have imported our on forms module. Okay, let's go back to the application and see. Yeah, at least that error is gone now. If we make changes in the select, the changes are reflecting back into the use case component. So yeah, the two-way data binding is working fine here. Okay, So let me do one thing, instead of, let me go back to this. So instead of pointing it to abbreviation, let's say in the value, option value, we are setting the name, right? Okay. And here in the select, in the option, instead of abbreviation, we can pass the value as name. Okay, it will be easy for you. Okay, if you set female, yeah, it is synchronizing. If you say other, it is synchronizing well. So two data band is working fine for the single select as well. Okay, but there is one more use case, the ngModel support when it is applied on the select. You can also pass the objects. Okay, so you can also pass the object instead of strings to the option values and to the select, right? So let's check our solution, how it behaves when we pass object to the value, to the option value instead of the string. Okay, let's check. Let's move the code. And so in the selected gender, I have selected one of the gender from the genders array, right? That is female. And in the template, let's locate the select. Yeah, so here we are passing gender name to the option value. Instead we will pass the gender object. Okay, now let's check. Okay, all right, so you can notice one thing, it is showing the gender as object, right? Because to the value attribute, the option value attribute, it always accept a string, right? If you pass it on object, that object will be coerced, it will be converted into the string, and this is the string representation, right? But we lose the context here, like which option is selected. So instead of like passing the object to the value attribute, Angular provides one more attribute on an option, that is ngValue. If you want to just pass the string to the option value, we can simply use the value attribute, right? But if you want to work with objects, if you want to pass object to the select option, then in that case you will have to make use of this attribute ngValue, right? Okay, so now we will see like how we can support this attribute on the option. Okay, so let's move to the select control value accessor first. Okay, so what we will do, we will have to write one more directive, right? We will have to write one more directive, and that targets the select option. Okay, and for each option, that directive instance will be created and it will accept one input, that is ngValue. So let me show you. So let's write the directive first. Okay, let's call it ng option, and okay, let's decorate it. So it will be applied on the select option. So selector will be just this option. Okay, so let's define the property. Let's define one property here by the name ngValue. Okay, so it's an, let's decorate it with the input decorator, since it's an input property that will be passed to the option, to each option where this where this directive is applied, right? So let's define a setter for this. Okay, so it can accept value of any type, right? So we can pass the object as well here, and let's console whatever value is passed, just to verify like this ng option is applying correctly on each of the option of the drop down, right? Now what we need to do, back to the use case component, and we, instead of passing the value attribute, we are passing the ngValue, right? So this ngValue input property is passed, and to this we pass the gender object. So when Angular parse this template, it should apply this ng option directive, right, on each of the option in the drop down. Now let's check. Okay, so you can see there are three options for corresponding to each of the option in the drop down. This when we set when we pass the ng value input, when you pass data to the ng value input property, it is logged there properly on the console. Okay, now if you notice one thing, let me show you. Just pay attention on the drop down and try to look for the value attribute. You won't find any, right, because we haven't set any value attribute. We have just set the ng value attribute over there, right? So now what we will do, we will create the value attribute out of this, right? So ng value is like we can pass the object in the ng value attribute, right? But we will still have to keep the value attribute, right? Because when the drop down changes, when we change the option in the drop down, it picks the value from the option, right? So value attribute must be there. So what we will do, we will create the value attribute, right? The string representation for the value attribute from what we get in the ng value. So to set the value attribute or to update any, to make update onto the option element, we will have to inject the renderer and the element ref. Okay, so let's do that. Now when we receive the ng value, what we will do, we will write so what we will have to do basically here, like when we capture the object in the ng value attribute, we will create a string representation, right? So that, and we will also keep this object representation somewhere in the select value accessor. Okay, so before we write the string representation, okay, before we create a string representation of value attribute from the ng value attribute, let's do one more thing, right? So let's define one method in the SelectControlValue accessor and let's call it register option. Okay, so what it returned a string, and what it basically does, so let's define one variable as well, that is id counter. Let's initialize it with a 0. Okay, so what it will do, whenever this is invoked, it will increment this id counter by 1 and it will convert into a string and return, right? Now you must be wondering, okay, place a return statement as well. Now you must be wondering why I created this method here in the SelectControlValue accessor, right? So what happens, like whenever the directive is applied on the option, on each of the option, each option will register itself, right? So each option will register itself onto the select. You can inject this select by annotating the select attribute with the select control value accessor class, right? So the di will make this available for us, right? You know how di works. So di also dependency inject for the hierarchy of the elements. There is a parallel hierarchy of dependency injector, right? Like for the hierarchy of the DOM, there is a parallel hierarchy of dependency injector. Like for the select, there is a dependency injector. Whenever, and for the option, there is a dependency injector, right? So when any directive is applied, whenever any directive is applied on any of the HTML element, that directive is registered in the dependency injector, right? So when the option asks for the select control value accessor, which is applied on the select control, and hence it is registered in the dependency injector corresponding to the select element, we so when we inject the select control value accessor here in the option, in the ng option class, directive class, the directive injector of the select will basically provide us the instance of select control value accessor, right? And we just need to call this method, and we can capture, okay, this dot register option, this dot select dot register option. Okay, what it will return, it will return the id which we can capture here, right? So let's capture it here. Don't worry if you are confused like why are we doing this, because it will be clear in couple of minutes. Okay, just be with me. Okay, so we call the register option, it will assign an id for that option, and we will keep it here, and we will be using this in the string representation of the value attribute which we will be creating, right? Also do one thing, so we capture the value which can be of any type, probably of the type of object. So uh, we will put that into the option map which is defined in the select control accessor, right? So let's define an option map. So it's a map of key value pair. Okay, so map key can be string and value of any type. Okay, okay, so when the ng value is set, what it should do, it should set that object into the option map of the select control value accessor, right? So that when in the future when we change the option, it will consult this option map to retrieve the correct object, right, corresponding to the selected option, which you will see. Okay, so we can simply set this value as value. What will be the key? Okay, so key will be id, right? Likewise, all the options, they will get registered, and they will put the object which they receive in the ng value at the corresponding registration id in the option map. Okay, all right, now what we need to do, we'll have to write a string representation. So for that we will create a value string representation, right? And we can create a string representation from these two fields, that is id for this object and the ng value, right? So let's write this method. Don't need to put it in the class, but we can have it outside. So this is the implementation for the build value string, okay, which will accept two parameters. One is id, which can be null as well, and the value, and it will create a string out of it. If id is null, in that case we must be receiving the value as a string, so we can simply return it as it is. But if we have the id as a non-null value, in that case there is a possibility value is something other than string, so we can have a string representation as like this, right? So we capture the id in that string representation. Now let's go to the ng value setter function, setter method. Okay, so once we have the value string representation, we can simply write it on the value attribute, right? So just write a method to make update on the value attribute. So set element value, that's the method. Okay, so what it receives, it receives value as a string, or I can say any return nothing. Okay, and we have already injected the renderer service. Okay, so just call the set property method on that and pass the element dom reference where you want to make the update. So that is this native, and the key is going to be value, because we are setting the value property on the option. Okay, and the value will be the value captured in the value variable. Okay, so and we can pass this to the method. Okay, and we also capture the value inside this value parameter, right, on the value property, class level property. Okay, now you can notice one thing. While I make selection in this gender drop down, what it actually emit exactly the same value, right, that is set here. Okay, let's check. Okay, in the drop down just see 1 2 3. Okay, so these are the string representation of ng value, right? In the ng value we received object, we converted that object into a string, set it on the value attribute, and that same value is emitted by the select control value accessor, right, which you can see here. This is something that gets synced in the use case component, right, with the select value. But we don't need this, right, because this is we don't need this intermediate representation of the object we passed to ng value. Rather, we need exactly the same object which we passed in the ng value for that option, right, when we make the selection. So how can we fix this? Let's move to the code. So okay, so you already know, so in the last video where we had a discussion about like how we write the space control value accessor, if you move to here, so you know how ngModel register for the changes, right? It register for the changes through this on change. Okay, if you move to the ngModel, so it set up a view change pipeline, right, to get all the updates coming from the host element, right, where you apply the ngModel directive. So in this method, what the ngModel does, it basically this is the injected value accessor. It calls this register on change, right, and it pass a callback, and the base controller basically capture that callback function on this on change property, right, and whenever there is something like happening in that host element, some event being triggered by some user changes, it just invoke that on change method and pass the relevant value from the event target, right, and that's what happening in the select form element as well for us, right. But we need to update it here because we don't need the exact value coming from the value attribute, right, because this is an intermediate representation of that object. Okay, we have to convert it back into the object that was passed to the ng value, right. So for that, what we will do, we will override this method register for unchanged. Okay, so we will override it and we will assign to on change our new function. So in the value we are getting this intermediate representation of ng value. Okay, so we need to convert it back into the object. Okay, so let's define one more method, get option value, which will convert this intermediate value. Okay, so that will convert this intermediate value back to the object which you passed in the ng value attribute, right. So let's call this and pass the value string, and we can simply pass this value object back to the use case component. Okay, now what we need to do here, okay, so we need to extract the id from the value string, right. So let's define Let's define one more utility. So basically what it will do, it take the value and split it by this delimiter which we use when we converted our object into the string. You can see here. Okay, so we will split it and return the id at index 0. So once you have the id, you can simply see if we have this id in the set, right? Because that's where we put it, right? If you go back to the option directive, when we set the ngValue attribute, what we did, just captured that object and that registration id into the set, right? Which we are consulting now to convert that intermediate value back to the object. So simply check in the set, does it have this id? So if it has this id, then simply return. Okay, then you can read it, else you can simply return the value. Okay, so now you can check if we are getting the correct object back. Let's refresh it. Actually we will have to convert it into the JSON string, right? Okay, let's make a change, male, female, other, right? So at least we are passing the object which is eventually set on the drop down as an intermediate string value, and when we make the selection, we are able to retrieve that object back, right, and send it to the use case component. So yeah, that's good. Okay, so we noticed one issue, that is this gender dropdown is not setting its default value properly, right, when the form is created, right? So basically this is the default value for gender which we set when we apply the ngModel directive on the gender. So if you go to the ngModel, which method is called when the ngModel receive the input property ngModel, right? Which method it called the write value method, right? Let's go to it. Okay, and what is the write value implementation for this select control value accessor? Okay, so we need to write it here. Let's check what is passed here, right? So log it. Okay, yes, so this is the default property that is passed to the ngModel, right? What you need to do, if you need to select this female, the second option in the drop down, you will need to convert it into a string representation, right, that resembles something like this, and you need to create the string representation, and you can simply write that string representation on the value attribute of this gender drop down. Simple. Okay, so what we will do, we will basically for creating the string representation, what we need two things, value and the id. Okay, so for the id, what we will do, we will check the id of the object which we passed in the option map, right? And using that id, we will create the string representation that will be one of the options, right, which we have created. Okay, so let's say constant id, and we will have to define one more method, get option id. Okay, and we will create the value string calling this build value string, passing it the id and the value, and we can simply call the set property, passing it the value attribute and the value string, right? And we also need to capture like what is passed originally to the select control value from the ngModel side, right, which we can capture in the value. Right, now let's write this method so it gets the value of type any, what it gives a string, right? So this is a map, option map. Okay, it has a method called keys, which basically gives you the an array of keys, right? And what we check here, we need to compare the value which is passed to the right value from the ngModel with the option map values, right? And the option map is populated by all the options, right? So there are three options, so 3 times this instance of this ng option directive created, and each option basically register itself in this option map, right? So we need to check in the option map if we find any matching option in the option map corresponding to the value passed to this option id method. Okay, so to compare the two objects, we must have a comparator function. So let's define one more property. Let's call it compare with. Okay, so it's a function of type something. It accepts two objects or two parameters of any type, of type any. Okay, and what it returns a boolean. Okay, so we can say, okay, so we can keep a default default implementation of the compare with function. Okay, so we can simply assign the reference of this existing function on the JavaScript, that is okay. So what it is, it compares the two values and returns true or false. Okay, let's rename it to O1, rename it to O2. Now we can simply call this dot compare with. Okay, and let's say it's a private method, not to be used anywhere outside this directive. Let's prefix it with underscore. Okay, pass both the objects, the one which we receive in this method get option id, and the another is the one we iterated in the option map. Simply read it at the id. Okay, so if both are okay, if we find a matching option in the option map, we can simply return the id. Okay, and if we don't find any matching option, we can return null. All right. Okay, so our method can return either string or null. Let's annotate the return type same. Okay, so let's see if we are able to achieve. Okay, still you can see there is no selection. Okay, we don't have the default value properly set. Okay, let's move back to the code. Okay, so what's happening now, I'll just share one more thing here. So what's happening, by the time the right value method is called, if we put a debugger in the right value, let's put a debugger and refresh it. Okay, if you debug the select drop down HTML, there is only one option created, not all the options are created, right? But we are trying to set the value on the select which is not existing till now. So how it will set it? It won't set it, right? So what we have to do, we have to defer this so what we will have to do, we will have to set the default value when the option directive is applied, right? When the option value is set. Okay, so what we will have to do, so when this right value is called, by that time there is no guarantee that option tag is created, right? And the option tag, if you don't find the option tag in the drop down, you won't be able to set the select drop down value, right? Because the option is not existing there. So what we can do, we can defer this operation to the ng option directive, right? So whenever this option directive is created, Let's say we apply the ngValue attribute, we pass the object. So what we can do, so ngValue is basically setting the value attribute, right? So by that time option element is created and the value attribute is set on the option value, right? So what we can do, we can retry setting the drop down value, right? Here this dot select dot right value, and so select has already captured that value when the right value was called for the first time from the ngModel side, right? So simply pass the value which it has already. Okay, now what will happen when the options are created and all the options are created, they will try calling the right value method, and if 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 the select control value accessor has the value as one of the options which are created, then it will set it properly. Okay, so let's check now if the default value for the gender dropdown is setting properly. Let's refresh it once. Okay, so we are still not getting the default value selected for the gender dropdown. Let's check into the code. Okay, so let's check the implementation for this method get option id. So there must be some issue in the compare with. Okay, so we have the default compare with as this object dot is, which is comparing the two objects. All right. Okay, so when there is a string value in the drop down, then it will work, right? Because we are comparing the value by the values basically, but when we compare the objects, they are compared by reference, right? We won't have the same object reference, right? Even if the objects are exactly same in terms of the properties and the values they hold, right? We have to accept one more input property here for the comparator function, right? Let's say compare with, let's define a setter property compare with, which the use case component will have to pass when they apply the ngModel on the select. Okay, so it's so it can be a function of something like any returns boolean. Okay, and it simply assign this comparator function onto the private property compare with, right? So back to the use case component. Here we can define our comparator function, like when the select control accessor find the selected gender into the genders into the options which is created from the genders array, how can it match it, right? So let's define the compare function. To the compare function, we receive two objects, right? So basically we can compare this property name or abbreviation, any of these, right? And we can pass this as one of the input property, right? Compare with, I guess we have not decorated it. Okay, so we have to decorate this setter function compare with, right? And okay, now let's check. Oh great, now you can see the property which we set, the default property which we set on the drop down, it is setting properly, right? And when you try to make changes, it is emitting the updated value back to the use case component, right? Okay, and we're not getting any error either. All right, so there is one more use case left here. So let's say instead of ng value, what if user pass the value attribute, right? So we need to just test again this scenario which we tested earlier, like how our select control value is working with the value attribute, right? With ng value it is working fine. So we can pass the object to the ng value property, and it is setting properly, right? It is setting the default value, as well as when we make change in the selection, the updated value is reflecting back into the use case component perfectly, right? So let's check again with the normal value attribute. All right, so let's say we define the value, we set the value with the instead of gender we will pass the string here, right? That is gender dot name, and same for the option, we will pass gender dot name, right? On the selected gender we have other. All right, so let's make the change here, gender dot name, and in the ngModel also we have to pass gender dot name, right? We don't need this because compare with the comparator function is required only when you are using the ng value, right? Because you are passing the object, and to compare the object you will have to pass a comparator function, right? So we can get rid of this. Okay, so now let's check what is happening here. Okay, so now you can see the default gender is not selected, right? So it should select the other, because that is what we are passing to the ngModel, right? We are passing this gender name other as a string. So it's not setting properly, because if you go back to your select control value accessor implementation and check the ng option, so what we did in the ng value, so we define a setter method for ng value, right? So when we set whenever we pass the ng value to each of the option, we are basically calling out the right value method, so that we can set the default value, right, as I discussed earlier. So we will have to do the same thing for the value attribute as well, for the value property, right? So what we will do, we will provide one more input property. We will basically provide a setter for this value. Okay, what it will get value of type string, and it will basically call this right value method on the select, right? And before this we will have to set element value. Basically we will have to update. So when we have the setter for the value property, then we will have to manually update the value attribute on that option as well, right? Only then it will make the default selection in the select drop down. Okay, so what we pass here, we pass the value here, right? And there is one more correction I need to make. So this value attribute, right, so we are capturing the value here, right? So we don't need it, right? We can get rid of it. So before we wrap up this tutorial, there are a few checks which needs to be in place. So the first one is the selector, right? So this is very generic as of now, because it will apply to both single select and multi select, but this is something we have written select control value accessor for only for the single selects. So we will have to exclude the multi selects, right? And for that we will have to update this selector. So we will apply this directive only when the ngModel directive is applied on the select, but it should not have this attribute, that is multiple, right? This is something you will find on the multi select only. Okay, so in that case the instance of this service will not be created. And likewise we will have to make some checks in the ng option also, because ng option is something, it depends on the select, right? So option directive will still be applied on the drop down, irrespective of like whether it is single or multi select. But in case of the multi select, this option directive won't have access to this select control value accessor, right? Due to the selector we just changed. So in that case we cannot access the select without any check, otherwise it can break the code. So anywhere where we are making access to the select methods, we need to put this check, right? So this will guard us against any sort of errors. Okay, and we can make the update here. And again in the ngValue, if we don't have the select, we can simply return, right? And in the value setter, so we can set only, we can write to the select only when we have access to the select control value accessor. And there is one more thing regarding the cleanup, right? As you can see, we are each option register itself, right? Each option register itself, so it should deregister itself as well when the option is destroyed, right? So we will have to implement the on destroy interface, and which will implement on destroy method, right? So we can write our cleanup logic here, and again we will have to put this check. If we have the select, then the first thing we need to do, like when the option is destroyed, we need to remove this option from the option map, right? So there is a function, there is a method delete, and just pass the id where it is registered in the map, that is id. And should also update the select value. And the last thing, we should rename this directive from ng option to ng select option. Okay, and I also annotate this dependency with optional decorator. And make the change accordingly in the forms module as well. Right, and we can just check if everything is working. This is the default option we passed to ngModel on gender, and it is setting up properly, and we can make the changes and they are reflecting in the use case component accordingly. Okay, so that's it. So we just checked our drop down. When we apply the ngModel on the drop down, it is working fine for the text inputs as well as for the objects. So we can pass the text as well as object as option value, right? And it will provide the two-way data binding for both. So that's it from this video. I hope you learn a lot from this video and you enjoy it thoroughly. So in the next video we will cover the multi-select, right? So we will add support in our ngModel implementation for the multi-select drop down, right? So we will write one more control value accessor, right, which will enable the two-way data binding for the multi-select drop down as well. Okay, so till then, take care, and don't forget to subscribe the channel. And if you like the video, if you enjoyed, if you learned something new here, then like the video, share it with your friends. And okay, so see you in the next video. Till then, bye bye. Thank you very much.